A few things just wanted to talk about before we go on was prayer in the ancient world. We typically think of prayer, we think, okay, Israel, how did they pray? What were the other nations doing? Did they pray? Did like the ancient Babylonians pray? Did the ancient Persians pray? Like, how did they communicate with their, God or gods? A lot of it was petitions, right? I mean, they were pretty much going there and petitioning. But prayer is not unique to Israel. I mean, it's kind of a ancient thing that probably originated after the garden, and then as it spread, and then people went to idols and things, they would pray to them. And so usually it's, like I said, petitions. It probably wasn't so much like, let's get to know each other, we love you, let's grow a relationship. It was more, you're there, we're here, we need you to intervene and help and do, because we can't. And that's kind of the road it was on. It wasn't really too personal. Definitely offered in civilizations across the ancient Near East. Petitions and appeals to the gods. You had different gods for different things. You want your crops to grow, you go to this god. You want fertility, a lot of fertility gods. We want to make sure that we can have kids and that our civilizations grow. And so this is where you get into things like Molech, where they would offer prayers, but they would do it with sacrifices of children and some terrible stuff that was going on in the ancient world. But yes, prayer happened all over. Typically through priests and at temples, right? You would go in, you'd have to have the authorized person go before the deity and take that petition to them with some kind of an offering. They would have to be authorized and acceptable to the deity in order to do that. And so a lot of times people could not make direct contact with the god. They would have to go through a mediator. Doesn't sound that far off from Israel, does it? When it comes to the idea of temples and priests and a mediator and so on. There is some differences, but it's not unique to Israel. This is happening in Egypt and all over the ancient world. Israel's prayers involve petition, but they also recognized, or they had recognition of God's engagement with human events. That's really unique to Israel, is that, yes, other nations would pray and they would say, please bring us rain. But the Israelites recognized that God would actually answer them, and he would actually come back and forth with them with rain, and he would communicate. It wasn't a one-way street, in other words. So I went through the Old Testament, and again, this is not exhaustive by any means, but I just wanted to kind of look at different prayers and some things that were said in the Old Testament regarding prayer that I think are important. And so I kind of looked at different things I wanted to just share with you a little bit. A lot of times prayer was offered by a priest and a commoner alike. Most of the times, when you think of these other civilizations, you want to go to the deity, the ancient Egyptian deity Ra. How are you going to communicate with Ra if you were just a commoner? You have to go to the priest, go to the temple. They would have to do this for you. It's really interesting because you have that in the Old Testament with Israel, don't you? You have the priests, but then you have things like we talked about last week where the servant of Abraham, remember? He's just a common guy. Now, this is before the priesthood, but he could pray and God would hear him. And so as strange as it is that you have the priesthood get involved, which we're going to look at here in a minute, but you still have individuals who are not going through a priest praying to the God of Israel, Yahweh, and still having a response. And so God is consistent through the whole Bible. He wants communication with people. He wants prayers offered to him in expecting faith. And it doesn't matter if you go do it through a priest, or you go do it in the closet in your own house, or he wants the direct communication. Isn't that interesting? So you had the servant of Abraham. Would you say he was a commoner? Maybe we don't really get his name. Now you could say, well, he's part of Abraham's group, which is definitely not common. They were very unique. From looking back, you can see that. What about Hannah? The prayer of Hannah. This is Samuel's mom. She can't have any kids, and she goes. How does her prayer go? She goes into the temple where Eli is there, and she offers prayers to God. It doesn't say that Eli prayed for her, but where is she? She's in the temple, and the priest is there with her, and she's offering prayers. So there you kind of have like a commoner, let's say the lay person, going into the institution and offering prayer. And this is consistent, because when you get to the New Testament, you remember when Jesus is going to be dedicated? there's a woman there, Anna. And do you remember how she's described? She was praying all the time in the temple. So she's kind of like a Hannah almost, but not praying for maybe herself so much. But this is another commoner who's coming to the temple and praying. Now, why would they go to the temple and do it? Why wouldn't Hannah just pray from home? When you went to pray, you tried to get as close to God as you could, right? It's like anytime you want to go talk to somebody, you can call them because sometimes that's what you have to do, right? But is it better to be able to go and sit down and have a conversation? It really is. Better communication. You get to see their facial expressions. You want to draw as close as you can to the person you're communicating with. And so even though people could be at home and praying, they recognized in ancient Israel that where does Yahweh dwell? Like where is the presence of God in the Old Testament? The temple, right? Specifically there where the ark was and the Holy of Holies. And so since I can't go in there, I'm going to go as far as I can. And they would pray. It would just try to get into God's area to some degree. Get as close as you can. Offer prayers to him. I get the idea, which is, let's get close to God so we can pray to him, which is still a concept we should have, right? But do you see how we kind of would take it and say, I can only pray if I go to these places? There's still religions out there that believe that. If I'm going to go communicate with God, I have to go to this location at this place and do it this way. It wasn't this like, I can just literally say, I need to pray and pray right now. No, I got to go through all this stuff. Now, some of it you have to think is, if you really want to talk to somebody, because you really believe in this conversation or even this petition you're about to make, it's an act of faith to go to them, isn't it? I mean, think of the people who came to Jesus. It wasn't like, Jesus could hear me over here if I pray. But they went to him and they said, I, in faith, am going to you because I have a request. Right? And he would answer. So this concept of getting close so that I can communicate with you is fundamental. It's ancient, but it's what people did by faith. So Hannah's an interesting one. What about Job? You could make the argument that, he was not really anybody. I mean, we know he's big because of the book, but he was a well-known, wealthy guy, and he prayed to God directly. He didn't have a priest he went through. And again, this is probably before the priesthood existed. But did God hear Job and communicate with him? So God doesn't have to have a priest. He doesn't have to have somebody to communicate, does he? If he wants to communicate with somebody, he can do it. And I think that's the point of this, is God wants people to understand, you can talk to me, and I will respond to you. It's as simple as that. It really is. We don't have to overly complicate it. So prayer was done by many in the temple rather than in home in order to be closer to God. We talked about that. In faith, many would come to God's house to seek him and make requests to him. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Nothing wrong with that. But it's also okay to come to him in faith if you can't come to his house, to the church or to the temple or wherever it may be, and pray, isn't it?
Yes.
And we're going to talk about why that's possible here in just a few minutes, because it's a little different in the New Testament than it was in the Old. Here's 1 Samuel 1:9. Hannah got up after eating and drinking at Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the temple of Yahweh. She was deeply troubled, so she prayed to Yahweh and wept bitterly. So they went to the temple, and she's being harassed by these other women that she can't have any kids. And so she is super distraught, and she goes, and there's Eli the priest sitting there in the temple, and where is she? Out front, and she's praying. God. And remember, this is the story where he says, it's early. Why are you been drinking? Because she's like talking to herself type of a thing, remember? And she actually prays. Let's see if I have it here. I don't. She actually prays that she would have a child. And what does Eli tell her? Do you remember? May God grant your petition before him. Now, was that necessary? Was the priest being involved in that necessary? But it may have reinforced her prayer to her. It might have encouraged her to say, someone who's here as a representative of God, the priest who speaks on behalf of us and communicates to us, is telling me this. Maybe she went away feeling like she was heard. You just wonder, how this is obviously once you have the priesthood involved. So a couple more things. Many prayers were offered to larger groups, like for the nation, by authorized mediators. So this is where you start having these kind of heads of the priesthood, heads of the people come in, and they would pray to God on behalf of a huge group, usually the nation of Israel. So you'd have a high priest, maybe the king. Yet David do this type of stuff. You could make the case of Moses doing this, praying to make intercession for the people. We're going to spend a whole week talking about, does God change his mind? Does God change his mind to prayer? We're going to talk about that. So you have these people who are put in very high positions. We would say the king was established by God. That's he raised his kings up. And they would offer a prayer on behalf of maybe themselves, but also the nation. And so and they were doing that to say, God, as the person who's between the commoner and you, here I am asking for wisdom and how to govern. Please bless the people, keep them safe. And so you had this person kind of standing in the gap to some degree from that level, the high level. God heard and responded to prayers to all sorts of people, regardless of their position in society. I read through a whole bunch, and that's what I came away with. Is I couldn't find this, like these people didn't get heard, these people did, when it came to just people of faith who put their faith and trust in God, would offer prayers, and God would hear them. And it didn't matter if they were the lowest of the low or they were the highest of the high. It did not matter. And I think that's by design. I think God's trying to send that message where you don't read the scriptures in the Old Testament and go, he only responded to people of very high wealth. Because what would that do to everybody? Well, unless I'm rich, God's not going to listen to me. It disqualify. Yeah. And is this consistent in the New Testament too? With Jesus? I mean, did he just come to help the people with wealth and nobility? It was actually, those were the people that kind of rejected, and it was the people who were the outcasts and the nobodies that he listened to and answered their requests. So God is consistent through the whole book. David actually recognized a few things regarding how God responds to prayer. And this is something I want to just kind of linger on for a minute. Because I was trying to figure out, what were the requirements? Like, obviously we know how to say, okay, God, here's my petition. And we could go through the Old Testament version of Our Father who art in heaven and recognition and then making your requests and confessing your sins and do that. But when you look at the Old Testament, what did the guys who were close to God come away with when it came to prayer? What were their kind of fundamentals? So I looked at David's stuff to say, what did you come to conclude about prayer after all you've been through and your position? And so here's a few things he said. Psalm 34. The eyes of Yahweh are toward the righteous and his ears toward their cry for help. They cry out and Yahweh hears and delivers them from all their troubles. So what did David conclude? He's looking back and he's going, okay, what have I concluded about God and the cries and petitions of people?
God hears.
He hears who?
Righteous.
So there's a connection here between God hearing, his eyes are toward the righteous, his ears are toward their cry for help, the righteous. So does that mean that God only listens to the righteous? That's kind of a trick question. Because none of us would be here if God only listened to the righteous, right? There are times where God listens to the unrighteous. But in what way? Is it a very specific way? Is it a kind of a one-shot kind of a thing? What does he expect of people that come before him? So I thought this was interesting in how he says when the righteous come before God, he hears them. Here's Psalm 145. Yahweh is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him. Okay, there's a couple things there. Fear, truth, righteousness. Have you got them so far? Those are the three things that David has said. He goes on to say he also hears their cry for help and he saves them. So there's three pieces here that I'm reading this week going, okay, it's got to be in truth. There's got to be an element of this righteousness, whatever that means. I still got to figure that one out. And what does it mean by those who fear him? What's the attitude of the one coming to pray?
Respect.
Yeah, like a reverence, you're the one who holds all the cards here. I'm in desperate need. So when a proud person who does not embrace that decides to pray, which may be kind of an impossibility, What's God's response to a prideful person praying and telling God what he's going to do?
Not gonna answer.
Is he like, okay, I'll answer because they prayed? Probably
He
not.
answers, but
It may not be may not be what you want. And so there's this humility that seems to exist in requirements. David recognized, humility before God. When I pray, what's my attitude? Like, I'm going to demand that you do things because I think that I'm something greater than I am? It's not how it works. Psalm 66. If I had considered evil in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. So, in other words, there's something about that keeps the conversation closed. God says, not interested in talking. I'm not going to hear you. However, God has listened. He has attended to the sound of my prayer. Blessed be God who has not turned aside my prayer or his loyal love from me. So as David's reflecting and he's going, okay, I prayed and God heard me, but he wouldn't have heard me if what? If I consider and hold evil in my heart. So there's an element of righteousness and truth and purity that appears to be, at least in David's mind, necessary for an open ears of God. Would you agree? Is that fair to say? To some degree. I'm not saying this is like, we're going to look at the unrighteous prayer in a second, but what about people who are coming and saying, I really want God to act. I really am asking him to do something, and yet inside they're just prideful, full of evil. Is God like, okay? I guess the question is, what are they praying for? Because in pride, anybody who's come before God to come to Christ, didn't you have to humble yourself at some point?
Yes.
And you had to come to this place where you had to realize, like, I don't have it all together. And I thought of myself a lot higher than I actually am. And I finally come to realize that I am lost. I am condemned. I need saving. And so the first step to coming to God is what? Humility. And he knows the condition of our hearts, like he said. So if I come with this prideful, evil heart, God, do this. I don't think it's probably reasonable to expect a good response from that one, right? I mean, David was concerned about it. I got to make sure that my heart is right, so that it even says, search me. These are the guy that's saying, I want to make sure there's nothing in here that's unclean so that you hear me, so that I'm not separated from you in this, so we can communicate. Here's Proverbs 28:9. He turns his ear from listening to instruction. Even his prayer is an abomination. Who is this person? The prideful one. The person who says, no one can tell me anything. I got it all figured out. I don't hear instruction. I don't respond to that. And when they pray, what happens? This is abominable. So there's some prayers that God says it's an abomination. So successful prayer in the Old Testament, there was a connection between righteousness and prayers before God. Being right, praying right, truth, humility, righteousness. These are all things that David highlights as, you want God to have his ears open? Like, you need to be right with him. It's kind of an interesting thought when you think about it. Does being right before God matter in prayer? That's kind of the question. The question is, what do you mean by right before God? Because, like I said a minute ago, every one of us, if we came to a spot where we were living in sin, and it was before we were saved, and then you come to that moment where you put your faith in Christ, there was a point where you offered up, is it fair to say, a prayer in your unrighteous state that God heard?
But that has to be in humility.
Humility and faith that you're making this prayer to God to do what? To rescue me from this. And God hears that prayer from the unrighteous person. Isn't that interesting? But we're talking specifically about a petition they make before the God of the universe. Who is he here? Who is he listening to? Well, we're going to talk about the person and the priesthood. Because if there is a connection between prayer and being righteous, we have to figure out how to make that work. Okay, now we're in the Old Testament, remember. Okay, so you got to put your Old Testament hat on for a second. We could explain this in the New Testament really easy. But I want you to go to the Old Testament and figure this out. We do not have Jesus' death on the cross yet. So how do I get close to God and be righteous before him, and so I can offer my prayers and they're heard. If David's laments and reflections are accurate. How do I do that? So let's talk about the person. God hears the prayers of individuals offered to him. True? Yeah, it's true. His desire has always been to have direct communication with us, right to you and from you to him. Designed that way in the garden, hasn't changed. God looks at the heart, the motive, and the prayer of each individual. Is that true? Yep. Motive is a big one. Heart condition's a big one. And I had a lady I used to work with one time that her daughter had a terrible accident in another state, and she's driving from her house in Colorado to like Oklahoma. And she calls me because she knows my faith. I'm pretty open about it. I'm working with her at the office. And she calls me while she's driving and she says, "Can you pray for my daughter?" She had this terrible accident. I said, "Of course I can." And she said, "Because I think God will listen to you because you're closer to him than I am."
Okay.
This is what she tells me. But again, this is because there's this concept that I need to go to someone he'll listen to. For whatever reason, she thought he'd listen to me. And I'm like, listen, I'll pray for your daughter because it's important and I love you and I have a relationship with God. Of course I'm going to pray for your daughter. But you do know while you're driving, you can pray to him too, right? I remember telling her that because it just kind of caught me off guard that she felt like she needed to go through a mediator to talk to God. And I had a lady, again, a different lady I worked with when I worked at State Farm, and she had grown up in the Catholic Church. And she quit going. And I remember sitting next to her, we just sat a little ways, a super nice lady. And I remember saying, "How come you don't go anymore?" And she said, "Well, I'll talk to God directly. They don't need to talk to him for me." That was exactly what she said to me. And I remember being like, good point. And some of it, we become almost accustomed to being able to have this relationship with God where I can sit you know what, if I needed to pray right now, I would just pray. I'm not afraid to do it because I'm not afraid to talk to my parents. I'm not afraid to talk to my spouse. I'm not afraid to talk to my kids. When I need to talk to them, I'm going to talk to them. And I'm not afraid necessarily what I'm going to say because I'm just going to be honest and raw and open, and we're just going to have a conversation. I'm going to know who they are, and so I'm going to not, step outside the lines. But I do know that I can have communication directly. And I think that's how God wants to talk, isn't it? He sat down and he talked with Moses, and it says he talked to him like he was his friend. Face to face, kind of, but in an expression of we were like friends talking about what's going to happen. And if God wants that, then I shouldn't be afraid to talk to him like that. But a lot of people are afraid. They're afraid I'm going to mess up in what I say. Or do you know what Christ has done for you? Do you believe in him? Yes, I do. Do you know what he's given you access to? Walking into the presence of God and praying, you've been blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. You are an heir to the kingdom, and you're telling me you can't walk in and talk to the king? We need to talk about that. We make sure you understand who you are so that you know how you can pray. Because my dad and I, we talk every day because we work together. I don't worry about what I'm going to say. We just talk. We just have a conversation. Did you see what was going on in the news today? Did you see what Trump did? We're talking about all this crazy stuff that's happening, and we're just reflecting on it, and it's just a conversation. But yeah, he's still my dad. There's still an element of respect and knowing your place. But we just talk. Why can't we do that with God? Through Christ. Look what Christ has given us the ability to do. But getting that into our minds is hard, especially for a lot of people who are like, I'm just no good at prayer. Well, God doesn't need good prayers. He just needs people with a faithful, willing heart to come in and say, here's what's going on. Doesn't have to be 10 minutes, doesn't have to be 2 minutes, it can be whatever, but he wants a heart that's pure with faith to say, let's talk. If you don't have a relationship with somebody, it's hard to talk to them, isn't it? It's like, hey, there's this person out here, I want you to go up and I want you to have a very deep, heartfelt conversation with them. And you go, I have no idea who this person is. I've never met them before, I don't know them. That's going to be hard to do, isn't it? But if you know the person, isn't it a lot easier to have that heartfelt, deep conversation? The heart, the motive is really important because, if a person is like, I don't know what I'm doing, but God, and they know which God they're praying to, the Creator God, the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's got to be that God. Will you answer? That's even how the servant of Abraham responded, remember? He doesn't just say some random God. He specifies which God he's praying to, because there's a lot of people that have some strange theology when they pray. And I'm talking about not just the God creator. They're praying to nature, there's use things like karma, these types of things. These are not things that the God of Israel, the creator God, is involved in. It's amazing how the prayer of faith can do things. That's what we're told. And so the condition of the heart is extremely important. Would you agree? It has to be in a certain state. So let's go on and talk about this. In the Old Testament, not just anyone could enter his presence with prayers. You realize that? If you wanted to go into the presence of God, now I know we have this speech we might use in the New Testament, but I want you to go Old Testament, keep your hat on there. You go into the presence of God, where are you going in the Old Testament? Holy of Holies, the tabernacle, you're going in. You couldn't just walk in there and offer up a prayer, could you? That had to be authorized parties only. And it wasn't even that many. We're talking just one person on a certain day at a certain time, could go in and do this. Sin continued to create a barrier preventing this type of direct communication. We're talking being in the presence of God with nothing in between, no restrictions, and having a conversation. In the Old Testament, you could offer prayers, but you notice where Hannah was praying? She wasn't in the Holy of Holies, was she? A lot of people were praying on the roads. They were still praying at the tabernacle or at the temple, but they were not in the Holy of Holies praying. That was off limits. Why, is my question. Why couldn't they walk into the Holy of Holies and pray? Because the presence of God was there. And what happens when a sinful person walks into the presence of God? Gone. Even the priests were concerned about this. They had to go through all this washing and cleaning and all this stuff. And they were still like, well, I hope God takes this priest's prayer, on behalf of the country, walk in there and hope he survived it, And there was still incense burning. They would basically fill the whole room with smoke. Why did you need smoke? Why couldn't you just keep it clean in the air and just see there's God right there? Why'd you have to have this other veiling? So even with that, it appears there was an element of veiling. It's like, let's have a conversation, today. We'll get together. We'll fill the room with smoke. I'll sit on this side. You sit on the other side, and we'll talk. That sounds like a terrible way to communicate. As close as we can get. The problem, the people were not, I want to define this, right with him. Now, you can have the right motive, and you can have the right attitude, and you can offer in faith. And what does God say to that? What did he tell Abraham? Abraham didn't have a priest. He hadn't done sacrifices. He did them to cover sin like everybody else would. But he didn't have Christ at this point. And yet God still heard him and even declared him what? Righteous. How did he declare Abraham righteous? Because he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, right? And what's amazing to me is before the priesthood, you had no mediator. God's communicating with Abraham, and Abraham simply believes God. And God says, I'll give you righteousness. I accredit righteousness to you. So is righteousness an important part of communicating with God? What was it that made Abraham righteous?
Obedience.
He believed God. He put his faith in God. And God said, because of these things, you are right before me in a certain way. So is it important in prayer to believe and to have faith and to actually, when God says things like he said in his word, promises he's given us, to believe those things to be true? Because when that first moment comes from unbelief, there's a point where you say, I now believe. Okay, this is the moment of salvation. I now believe. I don't have it figured out. I am a sinful person. Are these all true statements? Yes. God is greater than me. He can save me. And this is how he did it. And as you're going through this in your prayer of salvation, you're speaking true things. And if in that moment you believe all those things to be true, what happens? You're saved. And then what happens when you're saved, when it comes to this concept of righteousness? Righteousness is imputed upon you. Now in the New Testament, how is that possible? Because Jesus' righteousness is now applied to you. And so when you're talking to God, God's looking at you like he's looking at his own son. And that's the kind of communication you can have. Isn't that amazing? That literally God would say, Let's talk like you're Jesus. That sounds really weird. But that's how it works. Because your righteousness doesn't come from yourself. It comes from your faith, comes from Christ. And when you put your faith in him, you get that righteousness. It's amazing. In the Old Testament, you had to figure out, how do I get right before God? Obedience was a big one. Do these things. Okay, I'll be obedient to you and do these things. So we talked about this. How does one communicate with someone who has and continues to wrong them? If you ever had a relationship with somebody that is like super hostile to you, maybe a family member, a friend, or someone that literally has just continued to wrong you. They have never admitted that what they're doing is inappropriate, it's wrong, it's hurtful, and they still stand by that in their pridefulness. How's the communication go? It probably doesn't exist, does it? Or it's very, very, very lacking. How do I interact with them when they have continued to embrace this attitude that they're right and I'm wrong? How many people think that and they have that relationship with God? I'm right, he's wrong. I got it figured out, I don't need him. Millions and millions and millions of people who don't communicate with God, or they communicate on this basis. I am not interested in you, give me what I need, and then leave. Leave me alone. What's a conversation like in a broken relationship like this?
Non-existent.
It may not even exist. There may not be any communication, right? So when you have someone who's living in this state of wrongness against this person over here, communication is severely hurt, if non-existent. Non-existent. So that's the state man was in with God from the beginning after sin. You realize that? Because until you come to that spot where you realize, I'm the one who did the wrong here. How are we interacting with God? Sometimes communication is completely shut off in this circumstance. There's a lot of people still in that boat, right? Sometimes communication is by distance. You have to set boundaries, don't you? Like, we're not going to be able to get together and talk this out. What are we going to have to do? I mean, the wrongs could be so, bad that you literally have to say, we have to have these boundaries. Like, we have to talk on the phone, but we cannot get together. There's relationships like that. So you have a distance. Does that sound like something in the Old Testament a little bit? You had some people say, I want to go communicate, but they still weren't right. So they had to stand outside. You couldn't walk into the Holy of Holies, could you? There was distance still. And then you also had this. Sometimes communication is necessary by a mediator. That happens in our world today, doesn't it? It's like, I can't, so I'm going to go share my thoughts. That's why they have counselors, share what I feel or what I think happened. And then this person who thinks that they're right goes and shares what and they try to counsel you so that you can have a restored relationship. With the goal of, what's the goal of that? To eventually not have the counselor at all and be able to have the two people back together. These are all things that I see in the Old Testament. Communication was shut off. Then when it's somewhat restored through the priesthood in general, you got individuals still, but the priesthood in general is now we can talk, but we got to have some distance. And by the way, we also got to have somebody that kind of can go between. God established a group of mediators, which is the priesthood, via Aaron, Moses' brother. We need somebody that's going to come before me, and I'm going to talk with them, I'll interact with them. They're authorized to come before me. And then they can go and talk to the people, and the people can come and talk to them. They can come and talk to me, and this mediation happened. I look at that as, well, you only need that in a broken relationship. In perfect, direct relationships, you can just talk to each other if they're good. You don't have to have a mediator. These men were to be separate, holy from all others in order to come before God on behalf of the people. Remember all the stuff they had to go through just to make sure they didn't somehow defile the place where God's like, sorry, didn't hear your prayer. The atonement prayer, not hearing it. You weren't right before me. The priest's cleaning, changing his clothes and doing all this stuff. These priests, through sacrifices and offerings, offered prayers and petition to God on behalf of themselves first, then the people. So I got to make sure I'm in a position, and now I can offer it on your behalf. Individuals could pray to God, but they could not enter his presence due to their sinfulness. They had to go through all the obedience rituals of purification and cleanliness. They had to do their own sacrifices. It's a covering, is what this is. The priests were not entirely righteous in the ultimate sense.
Right.
But they obeyed and did what God asked them to do so that they could come in. It's covered. It's like kind of like it's there. We don't have to look at this mess under the rug. You know, you just sweep it under and then you throw the rug over it and you're like, doesn't it look nice with the rug there? And then you peel the rug back and what do you have?
A mess.
You've been kicking your dirt under there for the last 6 months and you're going, oh my goodness, like this is just a mess. The real issue is God can look at that and say, what a beautiful rug. But he knows underneath it is what? A mess. That's how the sacrifices worked. The key is, how do you clean under the rug? How do you get that swept perfectly clean so that you don't have to worry about that mess anymore when God looks at it? And see, this is all setting up what's to come. When God does the priesthood and he does all this stuff, it's a way of saying, you do realize I have a bigger plan in this. And this is supposed to be a reflection to some degree of what I'm going to do here in the future. So the priest represented something important, and this is where we're going to wrap up today. What did the priest represent? First is this. Did you ever think about the priest representing Adam in the garden? You have to go all the way back to Genesis and think about this for a second. Adam is the first man, and he's made without sin, right? He's holy. And what's his role? Where's he at? Maybe I should say first. He's in where? The garden. Was the whole world the Garden of Eden? No, you had Eden. It was a garden in a specific place. And this is where Adam and Eve were. And what was his job? Take care of Eden. Take care of the garden. Tend to it. Do all these things. And if things would have gone really well, what would have happened? They would have had kids, been fruitful and multiply.
Stayed perfect.
Yeah, stayed perfect, spread out over the whole earth. But what would have still been happening in Eden? Ever wonder that? Where did God dwell on the earth? He would have been in Eden, right? And Adam is his first man. Some would call him the federal head of the human race. Have you ever heard that term? He was the one who was going to be the guy that kind of was, you reside here in my garden as my representative. But you're still going to have all these kids, and you're still going to have this relationship, but you're kind of my guy to start this whole thing. But you needed someone who was going to come and be perfect before God. You needed a perfect mediator. That's what the priesthood represents. It wasn't a perfect one, but it was a mediator. I'll show you this. Look at this. This is where God makes the priesthood. He says, and bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from the midst of the Israelites to serve as priests for me. Then he describes what he puts on them. A breastpiece and an ephod and a robe and a tunic of specially woven fabric, a turban and a sash, and they will make holy garments for Aaron your brother and for his sons to serve as priests for me. Okay, so this is Aaron and his family becoming the priesthood. Then he says, and you will take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the Israelites with 6 of their names on the one stone and the remaining 6 on the second according to their genealogies. So now part of the outfit is these stones, right? Look at Genesis 2. Now a river flowed out of Eden that watered the garden, and from there it diverged and became 4 branches. The name of the first is the Fishon. It went around all the land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of the land is good. Bdellium and onyx stones are there. Why onyx in both places? Why is God concerned with onyx being on the priest? But yet Eden is described as a place where there's onyx stones. Okay? It doesn't stop there. You will make a brass piece of judgment, a work of skilled craftsmen. You will make it like the work of the ephod. You will make it of gold, blue, and purple, and crimson yarns, and finely twisted linen. It will be squared, double, a span its length, and a span its width. And you will fill it with stone mounting, 4 rows of a stone. A row of carnelian, topaz, and emerald is the first row, and the second row is malachite, a sapphire, and a moonstone. The third row is jacinth and agate, and an amethyst, and the fourth row is turquoise, and an onyx, and a jasper. Their settings will be woven with gold. Okay, these are precious stones, obviously. You see these also in Revelation, but they also show up in Eden. Did you know that? Look at this in Ezekiel. He's talking about this cherubim, You are a perfect model, full of an example, full of wisdom and perfect of beauty. You were in Eden in the garden of God, and every precious stone was your adornment. Carnelian, topaz, moonstone. Turquoise, onyx, jasper. Sapphire, malachite, emerald, and gold was the craftsmanship of your settings. This is exactly the same thing he's telling Moses about the priest's garment. But isn't it interesting that these are the mountings of this guardian cherub, the king of Tyre is what it is in Ezekiel. Some actually think this is a reference to Adam. It's not actually to Lucifer or Satan. This is actually Adam. I'm showing this to you because the priest is supposed to represent also this Adamic individual who could come into the presence of God where he resides and interact with him. And God's giving them kind of like a shadow of that in this priesthood garment, okay? The priest was to be in the role of the righteous, direct communicator to God. You got to make sure you're righteous and you can go in and you can have these conversations. Now, if you will carefully listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you will be a treasured possession for me out of all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, but you will belong to me as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the question is, does this mean that God wanted every one of his people to be priests? What was the benefit of being the priest? You got to go into the presence of God. Does God want everybody to be able to do that? Is that maybe an element of this beyond even just being the ones that would go amongst the nations? But I think there's something a little deeper than that. I want all of you to be able to come right into the presence and communicate with me because I have a plan and I have work for you to do. Fast forward, welcome to the New Testament. When you come to Christ, you now are righteous before God. God fills you with his Spirit. You are welcome to come into his presence. And guess what he says? Now I have work for you to do. My kingdom of priests is established, and you now are to go and make disciples of all the nations. I have work for you to do. And that's not possible unless you're righteous before God. The priest represented that. In the New Testament, we actually got that. You get to go behind the curtain now, and have this conversation directly